your supplement number 55. Following this song, we'll be dismissed to our classes.
I read the word of God, and then at once rejoice, for when I listen to its call, I hear my Father's voice. Its every line repeats His will decreed above, and every word makes evident His wisdom, might, and love. Within its least of theme, and in its smallest part, I find the fire to light again His worship in my heart. Now be dismissed to class.
Good morning. Oh, that was rough. Joshua chapter 2, that's where we're going to be continuing our study. And Lord willing, we'll be able to finish up Joshua chapter 2. There are some things that are interesting about the whole story of Rahab that we're kind of saving for Joshua chapter 6 as far as Jericho and the actual conquest of Jericho. Of course, she'll show up again there. Now, we'll probably read some verses from Joshua chapter 6, but if you're thinking, what about how big the walls of Jericho are and all that, we're going to get there, but probably not be there this morning. But we've covered quite a bit of ground regarding Rahab. If you have questions about Rahab and whether she lied or not, there's material in the back. And feel free to get a hold of that. We're going to have to move on, but I feel like we covered that pretty well. So if you have more questions about that, be happy to give you that material and catch you up on what we've covered. Okay, so as we look at Joshua chapter 2, we'll go ahead and read beginning in verse 15, but I want to just go back up a little bit. We are going to go back to the earlier part of Joshua 2 and refresh our minds a little bit about what an amazing level of faith so early on that she had. I know we talked about that, but I just think that's really important. So when you read in the New Testament that she had faith, she is transitioning into greater faith even. And you can even see, I think, somewhat of a difference from Joshua 2 to Joshua 6, but we're going to talk a little bit more about her faith and how that really relates to us, but with her background. So somebody give me a little bit of background with her. That even makes this more amazing to me. I mean, who is Rahab and what would her background have been like? Anybody? So the Bible describes her as a harlot. I know some question that, but I don't. We don't. So she was a harlot, Rahab the harlot. That's said over and over. I don't think that means she's just an innkeeper myself. I think it is what it says. Okay. Yeah. No, it was not a faithful city. Now, one of the interesting things, and we'll talk more about this in Joshua 6. Anybody have any idea how many people might have lived in Jericho? Actually, would you think it was big or small? They had walls, but actually pretty small. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people were looking at in the thousands, the early thousands, okay? So, but it actually makes sense having a big formidable wall if you're not, it's not like Nineveh or something. So they have this formidable wall, and we'll talk more about that. But that might cause you to, when she talks about her heart's melted and all that, and we'll talk more about that today, they're very dependent on their protection, their wall of protection, okay? So If that falls, they're done, all right? We'll come back to that. But so you have Jericho, her background. We talked about not known for morality, but she was a Canaanite, had a Canaanite background, pagan background. What would that have looked like? Just generally, pagan background. What are we looking at? Yeah, right. What did you say, Alan? Idolatry. And you think about the immorality that comes with idolatry throughout the Bible. I mean, both Old Testament and New Testament. In fact, when Gentiles were coming out of idolatry, and you read what Paul wrote, what did he write about a lot? Not just the idolatry, but what else? Sexual immorality. I mean, that was just part and parcel to the idolatry. If you're making an idol, in your mind, say whatever you want him to say, you're going to fulfill the appetites of the flesh. And so you would say a very fleshly background. Polytheistic, idolatrous, immoral, kind of scandalous from a Jewish perspective. Yet, Rahab is talked about in the New Testament because she helps these spies, right, and protects them. But she has this belief in God, and I know I've mentioned this before, but not just a God over a certain people, because a lot of the pagans thought, well, maybe Yahweh is over Israel and our God's over us, and then you have this other region over here. No, not at all. In fact, she confesses he's God of what? Of heaven and earth. Yeah, she's confessing he's the true, almighty, all-powerful God. And that's why we're concerned, she says. That's why our hearts melt. And that's actually going to be a fulfillment of prophecy, that this is how this conquest would actually go. And I think that will be beneficial to us. So, having said all that, if I can find my clicker somewhere, what did I do with it? There it is. So, let's look at chapter 2 and read verse 15. And we're going to read all the way through verse 24. So, if we could do 2:15 through 20. And then somebody else could take us down to verse 24. Who should I? Carl Hunt, if you would just do 15 to 20. And Austin, could you finish this out and take us all the way down verses 21 through 24? Okay?
Then she led them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She dwelt on the wall. She said to them, "Get to the mountain. Let the pursuers meet. Hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned, and afterward you may go your way." So the men said to her, "We will be blameless at this oath of yours which you have made. Swear, unless when we come into the land, bind this line of scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. Unless you bring your father, your mother, your brothers, and all your father's household to your own home. So it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head. Will be guiltless. Whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid on him. Tell this business of ours, then we will be free from your oath made. Swear."
She said, "According to your words, so be it." So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. They departed and came to the hill country, and remained there for 3 days until the pursuers returned. Now the pursuers had sought them all along the road, but had not found them. Then the 2 men returned and came down from the hill country and crossed over and came to Joshua the son of Nun. They related to him all that had happened to them. And they said to Joshua, "Surely the Lord has given all the land into our hands. Moreover, all the inhabitants of the land have melted away."
Okay. So, if you'll go back to chapter 2 and verse 15, and this is kind of an interesting section that we're pretty familiar with, but it says that Rahab let the spies down by this rope through a window, and the text says, depending on your translation, because her house was either on or in the wall, which is interesting if you're wondering, okay, how strategic is where she's actually located? What do you think it means that it was on? What do you think that looked like? Anybody? Anybody professionals on building around here? Go ahead, Daryl. Daryl. Daryl said he's a professional on that, so go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Oh, wow, you are a professional, aren't you? Did everybody basically hear what Daryl was saying there? So you could have somebody's house there in the wall, and as far as her letting the spies down, she certainly would have been able to do that. One of the commentators that I've appreciated on the book of Joshua just said basically what Daryl did. In biblical times, cities would build defensive fortifications in which a double wall was built to allow storage areas and even living quarters. So that's where she was. So whether you think of on the wall or in the wall, probably, in the wall, it served as her wall, and there would have been a window there. So Rahab lets the spies down at the foot of the wall. She has a rather extensive conversation either then. The grammar would allow, I probably think she had it then, but maybe they had talked about these things, because some translations render that as she had said these things to them. But nevertheless, they have a conversation, I'll get you in just a minute, Toby, with the conditions of their agreement. So they have an agreement. They're going to help her, and they're going to help her family, unless she what? Yeah, if she doesn't hold her end up on her side of it, then, so in a sense, it's kind of like what we think of as a covenant agreement. They're going to help her, but they need her to play ball, we might say here. And she certainly is going to do that very quickly. So, Toby, what were you saying? Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Right. That's a good point. That's a good point. Anybody else on that particular point before we move on? Okay. So she lets them down based on verses 15 and 16. And certainly there's room there for that conversation to have been going on. So let's look at what some of the conditions were that we just read about. So Rahab and her family would be rescued, and those who were with her, only if she met certain conditions. And I know we've talked a lot about it, and probably throughout Joshua we'll talk about it. Usually we talk about the walls of Jericho along this line, but even here, we again see these principles of how God's grace and power and faith and obedience interact with each other. And so I think when we study through the Old Testament, if you can see those principles, those have always been the way God interacted with those who would be faithful to Him. And that's no different now. She was being saved by God's grace, wasn't she? And she certainly didn't deserve it. She didn't earn it or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that there weren't conditions. In fact, if she didn't meet the conditions, she didn't receive God's grace, not because God wasn't gracious, but because she had not been obedient to what He asked. Okay, Roger, what were you going to say? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. And it is true, and I know we've talked about this a lot, but I think it's important to understand in many ways, both in the Old and the New Testament, when you think of like saving belief or faith, it is trust. Certainly you can't have faith if you don't trust God, and we often talk about trusting God. But when you think about trusting God, what does that look like exactly? It would not be some type of non-doing trust. That's kind of a contradiction all by itself. If I really trust, then I'm going to take action in that way. And faith is used that way in the New Testament. Paul uses faith that way, that it's not a faith that's inactive. That would be dead. James says faith without works is dead. And there he's using works to talk about activity. And so I think you see the same thing from Rahab. So the fact that God has commands, and this is really what we want to keep emphasizing, and it might be helpful when you're studying with somebody, the fact that God requires something or commands something or asks us to do something doesn't undermine grace at all. It never has and it never will, because we're still saved by God's grace. We're still delivered by God's grace. Rahab was still going to be delivered by God's grace and God's power, but there were conditions that had to be met for a lot of different reasons here, and I think that's important. So when you look at verse 14, of course, and this is logical from a strategic military standpoint, he says, okay, you'll be rescued if, there's if, by the way, kind of like in the New Testament when he says, if you do these things, you will never fall. So if you do not tell this business of ours, obviously, don't tell everybody we're here. Now, were there some people that knew they were there anyway? Yeah, but still he's saying, we need you to try to keep this quiet. Chapter 2 and verse 18, and this is kind of interesting. We'll talk a little bit about it today. Chapter 2 and verse 18, it says, you tie a cord of scarlet thread in the window through which you let us down. Okay, why would she need to do that for them? Identification. So, you know, when they're coming in this conquest in, and you think about Jericho, when they see that cord coming out from her window, they know that she's obeyed what they asked, she's done what she should do, and all of that. Next, chapter 2 and verse 18 also says, she was to gather herself and those she wanted to protect into her father's house. Were they to come outside of the house? No. What happens if they come outside of the house? So, yes. That's right. That's right. So, a couple of things here. You have following the instruction about not telling this business of ours. Then you have the identification of who you are. So you can be delivered. Had to meet that condition. There's some shadowing going on here, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But then you've got to stay in the house. Now, as long as they're in the house and they stay in the house in that realm, how safe are they as far as God? Guaranteed. If you get out of the house, how safe are you? Okay. So when you think about maybe a New Testament application of that, spiritually, what would you say for us? As long as we stay in Christ, we're safe. If you do these things, you will never fall. If I get outside of Christ, I'm not safe at all. And Paul uses that language a lot, in him, being in him, remaining in him. So you can see some spiritual application to this physical story. Now, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. If they stayed in the ark, of course, that's interesting because of 1 Peter 3:21 talks about he saved, his household was saved, his family was saved in the ark, and in a sense, Christ is our ark. He's the vehicle of that. Okay. All right. So we see that principle quite a lot. Sometimes in the Bible, you'll have these things in the Old Testament, and you go, I can make all kinds of connections, and commentators are the same way. So you see this connection, you go, oh, maybe, I don't know for sure. And then there's others you go, okay, well, that's a little bit more direct. This first one is somewhere in between those options, but the second one to me is very much so, because you're dealing with going back to Exodus and that kind of thing. It'll make sense. So you look at this. Some indicate this scarlet thread has some interesting predictors involved in it, or at least reflections on it, I should say, more reflections. You have the scarlet cord, and I didn't think about this one that some have indicated. If you go back to Tamar, we talked about the different women that were part of the Messianic genealogy. She had twins, and she kind of wrapped around the wrist of one of her twin boys something like a scarlet cord, or a scarlet cord, actually. You can read about that in Genesis 38. But more importantly, let's look at Exodus 12. Turn back to Exodus chapter 12. Many would say that, and I think there could be some real legitimacy to this, when you think about the scarlet cord, you think about deliverance, you think about power, you think about God's judgment. All of that is going on with Rahab, and it's going to go on with Jericho. But let's go back and think. We've studied about the Passover before, but let's look at Exodus chapter 12. There's quite a bit of similarity here, I think, probably. So when you go back to Exodus and you look at chapter 12, all these principles, feels like they're getting replayed again. So when you think about this, let's read a few verses here. Exodus chapter 12. Let's read verse 13, Exodus 12:13. It says, "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." You can see the connection there. So if you come on down to verse, and we could read more, but if you look at verses, verse 21, "Then Moses called for the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families, and slay the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in blood, which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin in the lintel and on the 2 doorposts. And none of you shall go" what? Outside. That feels familiar, doesn't it? "And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning, for the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses and to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. And when you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, What does this rite mean to you? You shall say, It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt, and he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshiped." And you can go on and look at that in more detail. So when we think about the Passover and the story of the Passover, which we just read about, and their deliverance from Egypt, and he says, put the blood on the doorpost and stay in your house. Okay? With that said, what does that actually foreshadow in the New Testament for us? The Passover. Jesus. Okay, let's think about that for a minute. So Jesus, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 says, is our Passover lamb. So when you go back to originally thinking about this in Exodus and thinking about the children of Israel, and you think about Egypt, so they were in Egypt, they were in a sinful environment. God says, you follow me, I'll deliver you. You have the expression of God's power. You have the expression of God's grace. You have the expression of God's mercy. What did God expect from them? Faithful obedience. So trusting him, believing in him, following his directions. If they don't follow his directions, they don't get delivered. But if they'll follow his directions, by his grace and power, they will be delivered. So when you come to the New Testament and you read in 1 Corinthians 5:7 that Jesus is our Passover, well, we're in sin, and we were in bondage, much like they were in bondage. The only way to be saved is saved by grace and by God's power, but also to have faith that meets those conditions, and he delivers us. I'll go on to mention to you, some have suggested, and I think it's a fair suggestion, that Romans 6 has Exodus-type language. So if you look at Romans 6, the old man of sin is put to death, the new man is raised to walk in newness of life. In a sense, that's our spiritual Exodus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when he talks about the children of Israel and dying in the wilderness, what's his admonition to us? Well, don't follow in their bad example, okay? So we have this language in Scripture that we learn from. When you go back and look at the story of Rahab, though, and then you think about the Passover, and he says to her something very similar. In both cases, those being protected were not under any circumstances to venture, just from a literal standpoint, to venture outside of the house because of the conquest. God, in this case, and this is the point of Scripture, spared those who were faithful to him among the obedient Israelites in the Passover account, and also the obedient non-Israelites in the other. So, and I know we've talked about this, but this concept that God only offered deliverance, he only offered salvation, he only, offered these kinds of things to Jewish people. Yes, he had a very important purpose for the Jewish people to bring the Messiah into the world. And in the Old Testament, they were a special people. Now it's spiritual Israel. All Jewish and Gentile believers in Christ are spiritual Israel. But my point to you is that even in the Old Testament, whether it's the Ninevites or others, even in this case with Rahab, Rahab is showing faith. Now, what's Rahab going to do? She's going to come into the community of Israel eventually. She'll even be mentioned in the Messianic lineages we talked about, which is a great lesson for us. We'll try to get to it in a minute. But she had to meet these particular conditions to be saved by grace and by faith. Yeah, go ahead, Alan. Yeah. And I'm thinking, just emotionally, it takes a lot of trust not to try to run, which isn't going to work out if you try to do that. But if you're in the house, they had to hear all that was going on when eventually the conquest came. But she trusted God. So that's a good point. Go ahead, Tony. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. That's exactly right. So when you look at verse 21, you do have this mutual, so you start trusting God, but to trust in God, you have to trust those you believe God has sent. But these are the ones that are about to attack. I mean, these are the spies. But to go back to what Tony said, and we mentioned that Rahab, she follows the instructions of the spies, believing that's an expression of God. Now, there's a whole nother lesson right there, that if you know something is true to what God has revealed, and the way we would know that today is in his word, it's not a matter of trusting a person per se. It's a matter of trusting those who are teaching what God has revealed. And she understood that connection between their instructions and the God who had sent them, okay, based on what she knew had happened in other places. We'll come back to that. The spies did, and you're right, Tony, follow her instructions, and their lives were hanging in the balance. So let's go back here to Joshua chapter 2. Look at, with me, verse 21. This is her response when they give her these conditions. In verse, and by the way, the response to the Lord when he gives conditions is not to try to dismiss them or undermine them, or why do I have to do that? None of that from her. When you're desperate and you need deliverance, you'll see that from her. Verse 21. She said, according to your words, so be it. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied. And notice she did this right away. Like I would have done it right away too. And she tied the scarlet cord in the window. They departed and came to the hill country and remained there for 3 days until the pursuers returned. Okay, that's exactly, if you go back up to 16 and 17 and all that, that's what she told them to do if they wanted to escape. So she's following their instructions. They're following her instructions. Go on with me. It says in verse 22, they departed and came to the hill country and remained there for 3 days until the pursuers returned. Now the pursuers had sought them all along the road, but had not found them. So now they eventually get back. It says the 2 men returned and came down from the hill country and crossed over and came to Joshua the son of Nun, and they related to him all that had happened to them. Now notice what they said. Verse 24, they said to Joshua, surely the Lord has given all the land into our hands. Moreover, all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before us. There's several things we want to talk about that are interesting. One of the things is that's just about a direct quote from what Rahab had said. So they take to Joshua what Rahab said as being true. Also, you're going to see a major contrast between them and some other folks we studied about in Numbers. How did those witnesses, other than Joshua and Caleb, come back? You know, you can almost hear if they'd been in this situation, I don't know, Joshua. I mean, there's this harlot lady, yeah, she's living in that wall, but this could be concerning. Have you thought about what could happen? You know, and you could just go down that, and what happens after Jericho and all this. We know how they sounded when they came back. But these spies come back, and they trust God. There's some level of trust in Rahab. There's trust in Rahab that these spies are expressions of God's power and grace and mercy, but there's also trust in them that God is using Rahab so that they will be able to have this conquest, right? So God uses people, and sometimes it's surprising people to us. They recognize this. Now let's go back to her remarkable statements of truth, and then we're going to come back to what I just finished talking about. So when you go back to chapter 2 and verse 11, look at what Rahab said again. Rahab affirmed that God had dominion over all the heavens and the earth as the true and living creator. That's the foundation of everything else we're reading. Okay. Then she states that Israel, God, was the only true God. She says, the Lord your God is God. You could read that as Yahweh, your God, is God. Well, that's quite a confession, isn't it? Well, let's go further. Chapter 2 and verses 9 and 10 indicates that she trusted Yahweh as the God who had and would deliver those who would seek him. Then in chapter 2 and verses 9 through 11, I want to ask you about this. She mentions 2 events. I mean, there's so many events she could have mentioned. She mentions 2 events when we read that earlier. She mentions the crossing of the Red Sea, and she mentions what else? Yeah, the kings, the Amorites, Og, all of that. She could have mentioned a whole lot of things. Why do you think maybe she mentioned those 2 things? I think there's a reason, narrative-wise, like story-wise. She mentions their deliverance, crossing the Red Sea, and then she mentions that. That's not just like, I wonder what 2 events can come to my mind. Right. Right. I think so. Yes. So, yeah, so I don't know if everybody heard what Alan said was First of all, those Amorites and their kings were known for their power. So Jericho would be like a city nation or city state, however you want to say that. And compared to what they'd already done, I'm sure that's concerning. So all of these are monumental things. I mean, you're talking about Egypt as a power, and you're talking about these other kings as a power. So that just from the standpoint of power, and everything else falls into that. There's another thought. It's kind of like saying from A to Z. Okay, if you say to somebody, if they say, well, how much is involved in what you're telling them, and you said from A to Z, what would you mean? Everything. So if Jody's working over there at Nabholz and they say, how much you want us to do, Jody? And you say, from A to Z, man. they'll know exactly what you're talking about. We use that to talk about and everything in between. It seems to me the way this works, especially if you're in a kind of a people that story and narrative is how you have two things going on. As Alan mentioned, you have the power issue, but because these are, major powers. But the second thing is, it's like saying from A to Z. She goes back to the beginning of their deliverance, and then she comes back to the last, most recent, probably powerful thing that's happened. She says, look, we know the whole story. So we know what happened at the beginning. We know what happened at the end. We've got this whole narrative. And so when you go back to chapter 2, let's go back in verse 9. When she says, I know the Lord has given you the land, and that terror of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land have melted away from you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven. So there's a lot of things in that. Right? They're getting closer, by the way. They're also getting closer to Jericho. Then the power that they've overcome. I mean, what's Jericho going to do if they get beyond those walls? I mean, at this point, you have a mighty military going on. So you just have all kinds of things. She completely believes that and understands that to be the case, and apparently others do as well. Turn to Exodus 23, I think it's verse 27, and then we're going to look at Exodus 15. Her confession here that the people were afraid was actually a fulfillment of what God said would happen. And we're going to look at Exodus chapter 23, and then I want to look at the song in Exodus chapter 15. So Exodus chapter 23, let's look at that. Exodus chapter 23. And let's read verses, I'd like to get the context. So let's read verses, I'm going to pick up in verse 20, okay? Listen to what he says, and he's saying that you're going to have this conquest of the land, and now that's happening. It's materializing. Verse 20, behold, I'm going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Be on your guard before him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious toward him, for he will not pardon your transgression, since my name is in him. But if you truly obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and all the ites, by the way. and I will completely destroy them. Verse 24. You shall not worship their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their deeds, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break down their sacred pillars in pieces. But you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. If you'll be faithful to God, isn't that what they told, what God said to Joshua? If you'll be faithful to God, he'll take care of you. Then go on with me. He says in verse 27, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion all the people among whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. I will send hornets ahead of you so that you will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. He goes on and goes further with that. Look at verse 31. I will fix your boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the river Euphrates, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you will drive them out. You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land, because they will make you sin against me, for if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So he told them. Now, what I want you to see is that he says this terror is going to go before. Come to Exodus chapter 15. They're going to be fearing you before you even get there. Exodus chapter 15, let's look at verses 13 through 15. Exodus chapter 15, verses 13 through 15. Mike Binko, if you could read that for us, please. Yeah, Exodus 15, 13 through 15. Very good. Very good. Thank you. So, what she's saying is what had been promised. So, this had been promised by God. They get there. Rahab says it. They take it back to Joshua. They say, we're ready. I mean, God's ready to help us here, and we have confidence. So, the spies report in verse 24, it's simple. It's confident, it's faithful, it's direct, in contrast to those unfaithful witnesses in Numbers, chapter 13. So they essentially take the same words that Rahab had used and said, this is the way it is. And you have the go-ahead. Now let me mention just a few other things to you in the remaining time we have. Rahab, when she asked for kindness, that's the word hesed in the Old Testament, which is often used of God's love for us. That song we sing, Faithful Love, comes from that Hebrew term, really. The word, sometimes it's rendered as kindness, but it really is faithful love, loyal love that God asks from us, and it's to be steadfast, but he also has for us. Let me move ahead here. I want to mention just a few applications here of this that are interesting about Rahab. First of all, there are times when I think we, in our minds, limit God's ability to use certain people. Somehow he can't use other people. And we know he used Pharaoh and he used Nebuchadnezzar, but he can also take somebody like Rahab and through her willing participation with God's grace, will change over a period of time. And he was able to use her even in his deliverance, who is not who any of the Jews would have picked. Okay, there's not one Jew probably that would have said, hey, why don't we try to go to Rahab? So she's really a Gentile harlot. She's in a condemned city, and yet she ends up in Hebrews 11. She ends up in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5. So if God can do that with Rahab, then even in the most difficult parts of our lives, he can do it with us and for us. And so we need to understand that. We also see, as I mentioned to you, and this is why James mentions it as well, just her willingness to trust and to obey, to do what God says. I mean, if I say I trust God, but I'm not willing to follow his instructions, how much am I really trusting him? How much faith do I really have? So our faith needs to be evident in our choices, in our relationships, in our actions. If it's not, we need to question that faith. And he gave clear instructions, and I'm going to ask just a few questions that we've already asked. Did Rahab earn her deliverance? Certainly not. Was it necessary that Rahab obey God to receive that deliverance? Absolutely. Hebrews 11:31 says, by faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient. I want to show you something here. And we see it sometimes in Hebrews. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish. By faith she didn't perish along with those who were what? Disobedient. He uses faith positively. Negatively, he says disobedience. What does that tell you about faith? It's what? Obedient. Yeah. In fact, in Hebrews 4, he'll talk about faith, and he'll talk about obedience, and he'll talk about disobedience and unbelief synonymously. Usually we think of unbelief, we might think, well, they don't believe in God at all. But the way the writer of Hebrews is using it, and the way Paul uses it throughout the New Testament, the other New Testament writers, and in the Old Testament is what we see in Rahab, and that is this faith that acts, this faith that surrenders. Doesn't mean we're sinless, but it does mean we actively obey and surrender to God. And that's what we see there. And finally, fear of God can be a pathway to faith. If you look at her in Joshua 2, was she scared? Yeah. But what that ended up leading her to a reverence for God, to a respect for God, to obedience for God. And that's going to develop into a very reverent, healthy relationship when she comes into the community of Israel. So she started in one place, but you see that faith just really take over in how she goes. Go ahead, Tony, and then we'll be done. No. But there's clearly a change in her loyalty to God and her obedience. She's not living in sin from then on. Okay, we'll stop there.